Hello, and welcome to Flying Failures, where we'll be looking at the Blackburn Roc. Based on somewhat innovative underpinnings, the Roc was an attempt by Blackburn to provide a fleet guardian for the Royal Navy during World War II, though what resulted was a machine of atrocious flying characteristics that led an inauspicious career in the service of the Fleet Air Arm, so much so that the aircraft didn't even see out the end of the war before being retired. The Blackburn Roc was developed to meet specification 03035 of December 1935, which called for the creation of a two-seat fighter with the added ability to spot for the gunfire of the fleet, with its initial requirement being to mainly operate on floats and would be catapulted off battleships and cruisers, as well as being capable of carrier operations. One specific note of the 03035 requirement was that the upcoming model needed to include a turret, despite the Fleet Air Arm of the Royal Navy having no say as to whether or not this facet would be necessary. The insistence of the aircraft being a turret fighter coming from Boulton-Paul's turret design that was considered by the Air Ministry to be an efficient alternative to dedicated fighter aircraft. Stepping up to the challenge of specification 03035 were Blackburn and Boulton-Paul, with the Blackburn design team being headed by G.E. Petty, who proposed a derivative of their latest Skua, a two-seater dive bomber, with the Skua underpinnings being modified to include a widened fuselage midsection to accommodate the turret, thereby saving considerable design time, as well as providing parts compatibility with the Skua. Boulton-Paul, meanwhile, proposed to rival P-85, essentially a carrier-capable version of the land-based P-82 turret fighter created for specification F935, and would later come to pass as the Boulton-Paul Defiant of 1937, the main difference being that instead of an inline engine, it would be fitted with a Bristol's Hercules radial power unit as an alternative to the Rolls-Royce Merlin. Called the Sea Defiant, the P-85 was expected to be 85 miles an hour faster than the Blackburn Roc, but the Air Ministry decided to select Blackburn's model based on its trust in the company to deliver aircraft tailored for naval use, Boulton-Paul having rarely designed models for the Navy until this point. Essentially, the resultant Blackburn B-25 Roc was a simple conversion of the Skua, even retaining its wing-mounted dive brakes, while the only major modifications were the aforementioned alterations to the main plane and the addition of a slight dihedral to obviate the upturned wingtips. This ease of development seeing the Air Ministry order 136 Rocs on April 28, 1937, despite no prototype having flown by this point. Due to Blackburn's limited production facilities already being fully involved in delivering both the Skua and the Botha torpedo bomber, production of the Roc was allocated to Boulton-Paul at their Wolverhampton works by the Air Ministry, leading to delays in their own superior Defiant. The general principles of the Roc, as mentioned, were carried directly from the Skua, which itself had fuselage construction derived from the Blackburn Shark, including Blackburn's flush-riveted alclad, the Roc being of an all-metal low-wing cantilever monoplane configuration, with the frame structure being wrapped in duralumin, at a time when wooden canvas was still being used by many British manufacturers. The wings were provided with a slight dihedral, with straight edges, rounded tips, and an elliptic tail as the ailerons, while its most distinctive feature was its glass cockpit that provided good visibility, but with a front section that presented a very low slope, the fuselage being divided into two watertight compartments as per the Skua, so as to provide extra floatability and buoyancy, with the crew compartments being fully watertight on both sides of the cockpit. The overall construction was sturdy enough for catapult launch, but was also suitable for rough carrier-arrested landings, with a hydraulic dampening device included in the tailhook's arm, while the whole structure and wings cover were made of alclad cut into three separate units, and the twin-spar heavy center section was bolted beneath the fuselage that also acted as the watertight compartment's bottom. Of course, the most notable feature of the Roc was its main cockpit for the pilot and the rear gunner, who was nestled into the trademark turret housing, the canopy providing good visibility but with very high drag, while the gunner's own canopy was of a bespoke design not derived from the Skua, instead being sloped back to ensure the best forward arc for the turret behind, meaning that, on paper, the Roc, with its revolving quad turret, had more powerful armament than the Skua and could face any foe at any angle. In terms of weapons, the Roc was fitted with 4 .303-inch Browning machine guns, while an automatic interruption feature prevented the gunner from accidentally striking the tail or propeller, the turret being driven hydraulically using an electric pump, and the guns could be fired by the pilot through an electrical remote single trigger. Other armament for the Roc being the ability to carry 2 250-pound bombs into combat, or 8 practice bombs. Power for the Roc came from a Bristol Perseus 12 9-cylinder air-cooled sleeve valve radial piston engine, which was more powerful than the Skua and provided 890 horsepower, the Bristol Perseus having made its debut in 1932 as the first production sleeve valve aero engine, and proved itself a major commercial success both domestically and internationally, finding work in both the Skua, the Roc, the Gloucester Goring floatplane, and the Short Empire flying boat. However, what was a substantial success in 1932 was heavily outdated by 1940, and its performance in the field of World War II aerial combat was considered woeful at best, as compounded by the very poor aerodynamic profile of the Roc's forward canopy and heavy turret assembly, with the aircraft only capable of a 223-mile-an-hour top speed, a 700-mile range, and a 1,500 foot per minute climb rate, all of which could easily be outdone by contemporary fighters. This poor performance was generally the overarching reason as to why the concept behind the Roc failed, the machine having such an enormous gap between its own speed and that of the Messerschmitt Me-109 that, in combat, the Blackburn would never be able to defend itself, as the gunner had not the time to correctly aim and fire. Essentially, the Roc was merely target practice for its Luftwaffe adversaries, and with the rear gunner being so exposed in the midsection turret, a short salvo of bullets from his opponent would easily be able to either kill or disable him, thus leaving the defenseless Roc to the mercy of its foe. As mentioned, production was largely subcontracted to Boulton Paul in Wolverhampton, and despite the firm being forced to build a design that had beaten its own turret fighter model in the specification bid, the first prototype Roc undertook its maiden flight on December 23, 1938, followed by contractors' trials during March 1939, and later testing at the Aeroplane and Armament Experimental Establishment at RAF Martlesham Heath. During its trials, however, it became immediately apparent that the Roc had serious performance issues that essentially rendered it useless as a competitive fighter or fleet guardian, and while the Air Ministry were enthused by the configuration of providing a rear gunner turret, the Navy had grave doubts as to its effectiveness and ability to be integrated into the model without sacrificing its performance, the FAA at the start of World War II being more in favour of the Fairey Fulmar for its fleet air defence role. Early modifications were therefore proposed, but ultimately abandoned once the 5th Sea Lord, Alexander Ramsay, recommended that further development be dropped during October 1938, though by this point production had been approved and authorised to continue, despite the fact that figures within all branches of Britain's aerial defence considered the machine a failure. While Boulton Paul continued to build the Roc at the behest of the Air Ministry, they would exploit the generally poor perception of the Blackburn as a means of promoting their own turret fighter in the form of the Defiant, which had improved performance thanks to its better aerodynamics and engine, Boulton Paul suggesting that the Roc's only useful role in the FAA would be to work as a target towing plane for practice flights. Regardless, both the Defiant and Roc were proven to be completely obsolete concepts during the Battle of Britain, where the likes of the Messerschmitt Me-109 and Me-110 completely outstripped the performance of both models, and thus could only be combated on equal terms by the likes of the Hawker Hurricane and Supermarine Spitfire, thus leading to production of the Roc being axed in August 1940. The role of Fleet Guardian was instead granted by the Air Ministry to the FAA's preferred choice of the Fairey Fulmar, while a carrier and ship-based version of the Hurricane, dubbed the Hawker Sea Hurricane, was also developed, though the Blackburn Roc still found its way, by order of the Air Ministry, onto the decks of carriers throughout the first half of the war. While proposals were made to convert some Rocs to floatplane configuration, utilising floats handed down from the Blackburn Shark, testing during late 1939 showed instability, followed by the crash of the prototype at the Helensburgh Marine Aircraft Experimental Establishment in December of the same year. Though the stability issue was eventually overcome, the drag of the floats reduced the top speed to an underwhelming 193 miles an hour, and any attempts to introduce widespread Roc floatplanes were abandoned, the Roc floatplane instead being evaluated as a target tug for the fleet, but even in this role the machine would not perform, with the FAA instead utilising the land-based Miles Martinet. In service, the Blackburn Roc was delivered to 800 and 803 Naval Air Squadrons at RAF Wick during April 1939, with its primary role being to defend the Scapa flow, though its sluggish performance meant it was completely incapable of pursuing much faster Dornier and Heinkel intruders, with squadron commanders considering the Roc to be a constant hindrance to their operations. Rocs with 800 and 801 squadrons were dispatched aboard HMS Ark to the Allied campaign in Norway, where they performed combat air patrols over the fleet, but once again their sheer lack of speed meant that when incoming Luftwaffe aircraft were signalled, they simply weren't able to operate at any speed that allowed for a successful interception. Elsewhere, Rocs, alongside skuas, saw combat over the English Channel during the summer of 1940, providing aerial support to the Dunkirk evacuations, during which one Roc achieved the only reported victory for the type on May 28, when a unit from 806 Squadron shot down a Junkers Ju-88 over Ostend while defending British shipping, the Roc only being able to gain advantage over the Ju-88 by way of approaching from below and firing into the German's belly, mainly thanks to the rear turret's 88-degree vertical pitch. Throughout the remainder of 1940, Rocs saw action harassing German E-boats at the occupied French ports, as well as firing upon gun emplacements along the French and Belgian coast, though due to the machine being hopeless in its primary role, the type was relegated to air-sea rescue and target towing, the Roc soon disappearing from carrier decks in favour of the skua. After this, the Rocs saw little to no action for the remainder of their careers, the only significant conflict encountered by the type being a protracted duel on September 26, 1940, between a search and rescue Roc and a Heinkel HE-59 seaplane, the confrontation ending when the Heinkel returned to enemy airspace and the Roc was forced to retreat due to German flak. Eventually, the last examples were either dispatched to Bermuda for localized defense or were allocated to the No. 2 Anti-Aircraft Corporation unit at HMS Daedalus in Gosport, the last operational working for the type taking place in 1943, while 4 of those units withdrawn at HMS Daedalus were employed for ground-based local anti-aircraft defense until 1944, all 136 examples being subsequently scrapped, and the chapter of the Roc in FAA service being relegated to history. Overall, the Blackburn Roc was a machine doomed by its delayed design and production, its sluggish performance, and the generally ill-conceived concept of converting a dive bomber into a turret fighter, the Roc being remembered as perhaps the worst aircraft ever employed by the Fleet Air Arm, and quite possibly one of the worst fighters ever put to work in a frontline role. Unfortunately, the FAA essentially had the Roc forced upon them without consultation by the Air Ministry, and it was only once the machine had entered active duty in Norway that the ineptness of the design truly began to show, leading, predictably, to its early demotion to secondary duties and its complete withdrawal from service after only 5 years.